What would you do if an object so simple could unravel your sanity? That question danced on the edges of my mind the first night I saw it. The black balloon tied to my doorknob. It was an ordinary Tuesday night, the kind where the world outside felt quiet and still, almost suffocating in its silence. I was curled up on the couch with a book, the TV casting a soft glow in the background. Midnight approached, but I wasn't concerned about the time. At least not until the knock came. It wasn't a loud knock, just a soft, insistent tapping that made me pause. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. Cautiously, I approached the door, my heart thudding in my chest. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. No one was there. But then I opened the door, and that's when I saw it. A single black balloon, bobbing gently in the night breeze, tied securely to my doorknob. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of its presence. Was this some sort of prank? I lived in an isolated area, with no neighbors close by, who would come all the way out here just to leave a balloon. I reached out, hesitated, and then untied it. The balloon floated into the hallway, drifting lazily toward the ceiling. I glanced outside again, but there was no sign of anyone. Shaking my head, I shut the door, dismissing it as a bizarre but harmless prank. I let the balloon float up to the ceiling and left it there, thinking I'd deal with it in the morning. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My dreams were restless, filled with shadows and whispers I couldn't quite make out. I woke up several times, convinced someone was in the room with me, only to find nothing but the oppressive darkness. The next morning, I found the balloon still hovering in the hallway. I popped it with a quick jab of a knife, the loud bang echoing through the silent house. I cleaned up the pieces and went about my day, trying to forget about the strange delivery. But the next night, it happened again. Another knock just after midnight. Another black balloon tied to my doorknob. This time, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I was no longer dismissing it as a simple prank. There was something more to this, something sinister that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I didn't open the door immediately. Instead, I stood there, staring at the doorknob, willing whatever was on the other side to go away. But the knock came again, louder this time, as if urging me to open it. My heart raced as I finally turned the knob and opened the door. Once again, the black balloon greeted me, swaying gently in the night air. I snatched it off the doorknob, feeling a surge of anger mixed with fear. I looked around, but the night was still, and no one was in sight. My breath fogged in the cool air as I hurriedly shut the door and locked it, feeling as though I had just sealed something malevolent outside. I tried to ignore it, but the unease followed me like a shadow. The next day, I got rid of the balloon again, this time by burning it in the fireplace. I watched as it shriveled into a blackened mass, the flames consuming it until nothing was left but ashes. I thought that would be the end of it. But the following night, at exactly midnight, the knock came again. This time, I was filled with dread before I even opened the door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob, and there it was, a third black balloon, identical to the others, tied neatly to my doorknob. Something was very, very wrong. I brought the balloon inside, staring at it as if it would reveal its secrets to me. But it was just a balloon, black, shiny, and completely ordinary in appearance. Yet I knew it wasn't ordinary at all. There was a purpose behind this, a reason it kept coming back. I tried to ignore the balloon, leaving it in the hallway as I went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, haunted by the sense that something was watching me. The house felt colder than usual, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I could hear whispers in the dark, but whenever I strained to listen, they would fade away, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. The next morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I couldn't live like this. I needed answers. I decided to install a security camera outside, determined to catch whoever was leaving the balloons. Maybe then I could put an end to this madness. That night, I stayed up late, watching the live feed from the camera on my laptop. Midnight approached, and I held my breath, waiting for the knock. But this time, there was nothing. No knock, no balloon, just silence. I exhaled in relief, thinking it was finally over. But then, just as I was about to close the laptop, I saw it. The balloon appeared on the camera feed, not drifting down from the sky or being placed by someone, but materializing out of thin air, as if it had always been there. My blood ran cold as I watched it float up to the doorknob, tying itself neatly in place. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't even human. Whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything I could understand. And it was just beginning. I sat on the couch, staring at the laptop, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. How had the balloon just appeared like that? Was it some kind of trick? But no, there had been no one there. No one could have done that. It had appeared out of thin air. The cold realization settled over me like a heavy fog. This was not something natural. Sleep was out of the question that night. I left the balloon on the doorknob, not daring to touch it. Instead, I locked every door, every window, and retreated to my bedroom with a baseball bat by my side. I knew it was a flimsy defense against something so unnatural, but it was the only thing that gave me a shred of comfort. The house was unnervingly quiet, each creak of the floorboards making my heart pound. I lay there, eyes wide open, every shadow taking on a life of its own. The whispers were back, faint and unintelligible, but constant. I tried to block them out, pulling the covers over my head, but it only made them louder, closer, as if they were right next to my ear. I finally dozed off sometime before dawn, only to be jolted awake by the sound of something crashing downstairs. My heart raced as I listened for any further noise, but the house had fallen silent again. Gripping the baseball bat, I crept down the stairs, each step heavier with dread. The living room was a mess. The lamp had toppled over, the books were scattered across the floor, and the coffee table had been shoved against the wall. I looked around, expecting to see an intruder, but there was no one, just the faint sway of the black balloon still tied to the doorknob. It hung there mocking me, as if it knew something I didn't. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an eerie light across the room. I picked up the scattered books, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. But as I reached down to grab the last one, I froze. The title on the cover sent a chill down my spine. The Haunting of Blackmore Manor. I didn't own this book. I'd never even seen it before. But there it was, lying among my things, as if it had always been there. With trembling hands, I opened the book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with stories of hauntings and cursed objects. The kind of book you find in the back of a dusty old library, not in the middle of your living room. My eyes scanned the pages, and then they landed on something that made my blood run cold. The chapter was titled The Black Balloon. It detailed the story of a woman who had been tormented by a black balloon that appeared at her door every night. No matter what she did to get rid of it, the balloon always returned, bringing with it a series of terrifying hauntings. The woman in the story went mad, driven to the brink by the relentless torment, and eventually disappeared without a trace. The last entry was dated over 50 years ago. This was no coincidence. The balloon wasn't just a random occurrence. It had happened before. And now it was happening to me. I threw the book aside, panic surging through me. I had to get out of this house. But as I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, the screen went black. No matter how many times I pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn on. I ran to the landline, only to find the line dead. Every electronic device in the house was suddenly useless, leaving me completely isolated. Desperation took hold. I tried to leave, but as I reached the front door, I was stopped by an invisible force. My hand froze on the doorknob, unable to turn it. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive, refusing to let me escape. I backed away, terror clutching at my chest. I returned to the living room, my mind racing. The balloon was still there, now floating ominously in the center of the room. I could feel it watching me, its presence heavy and oppressive. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, forming words that I could just barely make out. It's not over, it's just begun. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and approached the balloon, determined to end this once and for all. My hands shook as I brought the knife closer, the whispers growing to a deafening roar in my ears. With a quick thrust, I plunged the knife into the balloon. It didn't pop. Instead, the balloon seemed to absorb the knife, swallowing it into its inky blackness. I yanked my hand back, horrified, but it was too late. The balloon began to expand, growing larger and larger until it filled the entire room. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thickening with a palpable sense of dread. I could feel something moving inside the balloon, something alive and ancient, something that shouldn't exist in this world. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The balloon deflated rapidly, shrinking down to its original size before drifting gently to the floor. The knife was gone, as if it had never existed. I stared at the deflated balloon, breathing heavily, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. That night, the whispers didn't stop. They echoed through the house, relentless, driving me to the edge. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw visions, flashes of a shadowy figure moving through the house, watching me. The figure was always just out of reach, just beyond the edge of my vision. But I knew it was there, waiting. When the sun finally rose, I was a wreck. My nerves were shot, my mind teetering on the brink of madness. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out, had to find help. But every time I approached the door, that same invisible force stopped me, holding me back. By the third night, I was completely unraveling. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, but it didn't matter. The whispers seeped through the walls, growing louder and more insistent. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. I could feel them watching me, waiting for me to break. And then, at the stroke of midnight, the knock came again. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the empty house. But there was no one to hear me, no one to help. I was completely alone. I didn't open the door that night. I couldn't bring myself to face whatever was on the other side. Instead, I sat on the floor, curled up in a ball, rocking back and forth as the house around me seemed to close in. The balloon was still there, still tied to the doorknob, swaying gently in the darkness. But now, it felt like more than just a balloon. It felt like a harbinger, a warning of something much worse to come. By the fourth night, I was a shell of myself, exhausted, paranoid, and terrified beyond reason. The balloon's nightly return had become an inescapable ritual, one that brought with it increasingly disturbing events. I couldn't go on like this, but there seemed to be no way out. The whispers, the shadows, and that cursed balloon were relentless. Each time I thought I couldn't possibly endure any more, the haunting would intensify, pushing me further to the brink. I needed answers. I needed to know why this was happening to me. Desperation drove me to dig deeper into the mysterious origins of the black balloon, and the first clue had already presented itself. The strange book I found among my things, The Haunting of Blackmore Manor. I retrieved the book from where I had tossed it and began reading it in earnest, searching for anything that might explain my situation. As I delved into its pages, I found myself drawn to the story of the woman who had been tormented by the same black balloon. Her experience was eerily similar to mine. Each night, the balloon returned, and with it came terrifying paranormal phenomena. But there was one key difference. She lived in a town called Blackmore, hundreds of miles away. As far as I knew, I had no connection to that place. So, why was this happening to me? Why was I being targeted by this same curse? Determined to find a link, I took to the internet, searching for any mention of Blackmore and the black balloon. To my surprise, there were more stories, accounts of people all over the country who had experienced the same nightmare. Most of them were obscure, buried in forums or obscure websites, but the pattern was unmistakable. The balloon appeared to those who were isolated, living alone, and each time, the torment ended in madness or disappearance. I was horrified. It was as if the balloon was a predator, stalking its prey until they were too weak to resist. But there was something else that caught my attention, a name that kept coming up in my research: Mary Hargrave. Mary Hargrave was the woman from Blackmore, the one whose story had been detailed in the book. But she wasn't just a character in a ghost story. She had been a real person. And she hadn't just disappeared. She had been declared dead under mysterious circumstances. According to the reports I found, Her body was discovered in her home, completely drained of blood, with a single black balloon floating above her. The mere thought of ending up like Mary sent a shiver down my spine. But what haunted me even more was the realization that she wasn't the only one. Other victims had met similar fates, all linked by the cursed balloon. Yet there was something familiar about Mary's name, something I couldn't quite place. That night, as I tried to force myself to sleep, the connection finally clicked. Mary Hargrave. The name sounded familiar because my grandmother's maiden name was Hargrave. Could it be that Mary was a distant relative? The possibility that this curse was somehow tied to my own bloodline sent a wave of nausea through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was personal, that the balloon was drawn to me for a reason. I spent the next day digging through old family records, poring over genealogy websites, trying to find any connection between Mary and my family. The more I searched, the more pieces fell into place. Mary Hargrave was indeed a distant relative, a cousin of my grandmother, twice removed. The Hargraves had been a large family once, but most of them had died young or disappeared under strange circumstances. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The black balloon was a family curse passed down through generations, and now it had come for me. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the front door, waiting for the knock that I knew would come. When it did, I didn't even flinch. I opened the door, and there it was, the black balloon, tied neatly to the doorknob, swaying in the cool night breeze. But this time, I didn't take it inside. I let it stay there, watching it as if it might reveal its secrets to me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, with no idea how deep the drop was. All I knew was that I was part of something much bigger, something ancient and malevolent. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling the house with their insidious murmurings. I could feel the presence of something watching me, lurking in the shadows just out of sight. The house felt like a living entity, breathing with malevolent intent, its walls closing in around me. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed help, someone who could guide me through this nightmare. But who? I had no close friends, no family nearby, and no one would believe me if I tried to explain what was happening. Then I remembered something else from my research. A man named Robert Townsend, a paranormal investigator who had written extensively about cursed objects and haunted places. He had a reputation for taking on cases that others wouldn't touch, and if anyone could help me, it would be him. I found his contact information online, and without thinking twice, I sent him an email detailing everything that had happened. It felt like a long shot, but I was desperate. To my surprise, I received a reply almost immediately. Townsend agreed to meet me the next day at a small cafe in town. The thought of finally talking to someone who might understand what I was going through gave me a glimmer of hope. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, waiting for dawn, the black balloon still hanging on the doorknob like a dark omen. The whispers continued, growing more intense, more urgent, as if trying to warn me of something. But I couldn't understand them. All I knew was that something terrible was coming, something I couldn't stop. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the darkness, I grabbed my keys and left the house, not daring to look back. The balloon was still there, swaying gently in the morning breeze, watching me as I drove away. I arrived at the cafe early, my nerves on edge as I waited for Townsend. I half expected him not to show, to dismiss my story as the ramblings of a madwoman. But he did show up, a tall, thin man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. We sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, and I told him everything about the balloon, the haunting, and my connection to Mary Hargrave. He listened intently, never interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "This is worse than I thought," he finally said. "Much worse." I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. "What do you mean?" He looked at me with those piercing blue eyes. "The black balloon is more than just a cursed object. It's a manifestation of something far older and far more dangerous, a spirit that feeds on fear, that has been haunting your family for generations. And it won't stop until it has consumed you, too." His words sent a chill down my spine. What can I do? How do I stop it? Townsend shook his head. You can't stop it. The only thing you can do is find out why it's attached to you and try to sever the connection. But I warn you, it won't be easy. This spirit is powerful, and it doesn't let go easily. I felt a sinking feeling in my chest. Where do I even start? He handed me a small, worn book, its cover faded and torn. Start with this. It's an old text on exorcisms and banishing rituals passed down through generations of occultists. It might give you some insight into what you're dealing with. I took the book, feeling its weight in my hands. And if it doesn't, Townsend's expression was grave. Then you'll need to prepare yourself for the worst. Because if you can't break the curse, it will consume you, just like it did Mary and everyone else before her. The thought of ending up like Mary Hargrave, drained of blood, a black balloon floating above my lifeless body, was too much to bear. But what choice did I have? This was my only hope, my only chance to break free from the nightmare that had taken over my life. I thanked Townsend and left the cafe, clutching the book tightly. As I drove back home, the weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating me with their grim reality. This wasn't just about a balloon or a haunting. This was a battle for my very soul. When I arrived home, the balloon was waiting for me, as I knew it would be. But this time, I didn't feel the same paralyzing fear. I was determined to fight, to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. But as I opened the door and stepped inside, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. And deep down, I knew that whatever was coming next would be far more terrifying than anything I had experienced so far. The house was a tomb of silence as I stepped inside, the air thick with tension. The black balloon floated ominously in the hallway, a dark reminder of the terror that had taken root in my life. But now, armed with Townsend's words and the old book he had given me, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, albeit tinged with dread. I placed the book on the coffee table and sat down, my eyes darting to the balloon. It hung there, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. If the balloon was a conduit for something far more dangerous, as Townsend suggested, then I needed to understand what it was, how it worked, and more importantly, how to stop it. The book was old, its pages yellowed with age, the text written in a language I didn't recognize at first. But as I flipped through the pages, I found sections in English detailing rituals, symbols, and chants designed to banish spirits and sever their ties to the physical world. The illustrations were crude but unsettling. Images of shadowy figures surrounded by sigils and flames, their faces twisted in agony. One particular passage caught my eye, a description of a binding spirit that could attach itself to a family line, feeding on the fear and suffering of its victims. The ritual to sever the connection was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and absolute focus. But there was something else, a warning that chilled me to the bone. The spirit will resist. It will use your deepest fears against you. Only the strong of will shall succeed. I didn't know if I was strong enough to face what was coming, but I had no choice. I had to try. That night, I prepared for the ritual. I gathered the items the book described: candles, salt, a piece of iron, and a mirror. The instructions were clear. I had to draw a protective circle, place the items in specific positions, and recite the incantation at the stroke of midnight. The mirror was to be used as a conduit, a way to trap the spirit and force it to reveal itself. As midnight approached, I felt the air in the house grow colder, the atmosphere thickening with a malevolent energy. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, and now they were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Harsh, guttural words that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. I lit the candles and drew the circle with the salt, following the book's instructions to the letter. The black balloon remained in the hallway, floating silently, as if it knew what I was about to do and was waiting to see if I would succeed. I took a deep breath, stepped into the circle, and placed the mirror in front of me. The book lay open at my feet, the incantation ready to be read. As the clock struck midnight, I began to chant, my voice trembling but determined. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but I forced myself to speak them clearly, not daring to falter. At first, nothing happened. The house remained silent, the only sound the flickering of the candles. But then, as I reached the final verse of the incantation, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs of air, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move, writhing like living things. The balloon drifted into the room, hovering just outside the circle. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, as if it were watching me with malevolent intent. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, drowning out my thoughts. The mirror in front of me began to fog up, the glass turning dark as something stirred within it. My heart pounded in my chest as I continued the chant, my voice rising above the noise. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching out like tendrils, reaching for the circle. And then, the mirror cracked. A thin line appeared in the glass, spreading like a spider web. I froze. My voice caught in my throat as I stared at the mirror. The crack widened, and from within the mirror, a pair of eyes stared back at me, cold, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as the eyes in the mirror blinked slowly, their gaze locked onto mine. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant, filled with malice. "You cannot escape me," the voice said, echoing through the room. "You belong to me." The balloon floated closer, now pulsating with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. The protective circle began to waver, the salt lines blurring as the shadows encroached on the light. I felt the unseen force pressing against the barrier, trying to break through, to reach me. I was running out of time. I had to finish the ritual, had to force the spirit to reveal itself fully. But the fear was overwhelming, paralyzing me as the eyes in the mirror grew larger, more menacing. "You're weak," the voice taunted, the words twisting around me like a vice, just like all the others. I gritted my teeth, fighting against the terror that threatened to consume me. I forced myself to look away from the mirror, focusing on the chant, on the final words that would seal the ritual. The candles flickered wildly, their flames bending as if caught in a strong wind, but I refused to stop. I would not let this thing win. As I spoke the last words, the balloon exploded with a deafening bang, the force of it knocking me to the ground. The shadows recoiled, hissing like wounded animals, and the eyes in the mirror vanished, leaving only the cracked glass. For a moment, there was silence, pure, blessed silence. I lay there on the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. It felt like I had been through a war, every muscle in my body aching, my mind frayed and raw. But then, as I struggled to sit up, I realized something was wrong. The silence wasn't normal. It was too deep, too absolute, as if the entire world had been muted. I looked around the room, but the shadows were gone, the oppressive presence lifted. The balloon, however, was back, floating just outside the circle, perfectly intact. A wave of despair washed over me. I had failed. The ritual hadn't worked. The spirit was still here, still tied to me, and now it was stronger than ever. I could feel it lurking in the darkness, watching me, waiting for its next move. I stood up, my legs shaky, and picked up the mirror. The crack in the glass had grown, spreading across the surface like a fracture in reality. And in the center of the crack, a small black spot had appeared, like a drop of ink seeping through the glass. I stared at the spot, mesmerized, as it began to expand, slowly at first, then faster, until it covered the entire surface of the mirror. The blackness was deep, endless, like a void that threatened to swallow me whole. And then, from within the darkness, something emerged, a hand, pale and ghostly, reaching out from the mirror. I dropped the mirror, stumbling back as the hand stretched toward me, its fingers long and claw-like. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filled with rage and hunger. The hand clawed at the air, its fingers brushing against the edge of the protective circle. I watched in horror as the hand began to pull itself out of the mirror, followed by an arm, a shoulder, and then a head. The figure that emerged was tall and gaunt, its skin as pale as death, its eyes hollow and empty. It was the same figure I had seen in my nightmares, the same figure that had haunted me from the shadows. The spirit had crossed over into my world, and now it was free. I scrambled back, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure stepped out of the mirror, its movements slow and deliberate. It was wearing tattered clothes, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes fixed on me with a gaze that sent ice through my veins. "You cannot escape," the spirit said, its voice a low growl that reverberated through the room. "You are mine." The protective circle was weakening, the salt lines dissolving as the spirit drew closer. I could feel its power, its malice, like a physical weight pressing down on me. I was trapped, with no way out, no way to defend myself. But then, in the midst of my terror, a thought occurred to me, a memory from the book Townsend had given me. The spirit was bound to the balloon tied to my family line, but that meant it was also vulnerable to something else, its own reflection. In a flash of desperation, I grabbed the broken mirror from the floor and held it up, pointing it directly at the spirit. For a moment, nothing happened. The spirit continued to advance, its eyes narrowing in rage. But then, as the mirror caught the spirit's gaze, it recoiled, hissing in pain. The darkness in the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The spirit shrieked, its voice filled with fury as it reached out to grab the mirror. But it was too late. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting the spirit's image. The figure screamed, a sound of pure agony, as it was pulled back into the mirror, its form twisting and contorting as it was dragged back into the void. The pieces of the mirror lay scattered on the floor, the darkness within them dissipating like smoke. The room was still, the air heavy with the scent of burnt candles and cold sweat. The balloon, now deflated, lay on the ground, lifeless and inert. It was over. The spirit was gone, banished back to whatever hell it had come from. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and overwhelmed. But as I sat there, trembling and breathless, a single thought kept echoing in my mind, a thought that filled me with dread. The spirit was gone, but the curse wasn't broken. Not yet. I had severed its connection to this world, but the balloon had only deflated, it hadn't disappeared. And that meant the curse was still active, still waiting for the right moment to strike again. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to find a way to break the curse for good, to end this nightmare once and for all. And deep down, I knew that whatever was coming next would be even more dangerous, even more terrifying than anything I had faced so far. When I awoke the next morning, I was sprawled on the living room floor, every muscle in my body aching from the ordeal. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, a nightmare that had seeped into reality. But the remnants of shattered glass on the floor and the deflated balloon beside me were cold, hard proof that it had all been real. I stared at the lifeless balloon, a mixture of exhaustion and dread washing over me. The spirit might have been banished for now, but I knew it wasn't gone. The curse was still active, still lurking in the shadows, waiting to reclaim its hold on me. I needed to dig deeper, to find out how this all began, and more importantly, how to end it. That's when I remembered the diary. I had found it weeks ago, hidden away in the attic, covered in a thick layer of dust. At the time, I thought it was just another relic left behind by the previous owner, Mary Hargrave. But now, with everything that had happened, I realized it might hold the answers I was so desperately seeking. Climbing the rickety ladder to the attic felt like descending into a crypt. The air was cold and musty, filled with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. The attic was a cluttered maze of broken furniture, boxes of old clothes, and discarded knickknacks, all buried under decades of dust. In the far corner, I found the diary where I'd left it, tucked inside an old trunk. I wiped the dust from its cover, revealing the faded, leather-bound book beneath. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. With a deep breath, I opened the diary, the old pages crackling under my fingers. As I began to read, I was plunged into the mind of Mary Hargrave, a woman who, like me, had been tormented by the black balloon and the dark forces it carried with it. The early entries were mundane, detailing Mary's day-to-day life, her love of gardening, her struggles with loneliness, and her longing for the family she had lost. But as the entries progressed, they became darker, more frantic. Mary wrote of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, cold spots in the house, and of course, the black balloon that appeared on her doorstep every night at midnight. As I read, I realized that Mary's experience mirrored mine almost exactly. She had tried to rid herself of the balloon, only to have it return night after night, bringing with it increasingly terrifying hauntings. She, too, had sought answers, delving into the occult in a desperate attempt to understand what was happening to her. But it was what I found near the end of the diary that truly unsettled me. In one of her last entries, Mary wrote about discovering a hidden room in the basement, a room filled with black balloons, old photographs, and strange, ritualistic symbols. Among the items she found there was a photograph of a young boy holding a black balloon, his face twisted into a disturbing smile. Mary became obsessed with the photograph, convinced that the boy was somehow connected to the curse that had plagued her family for generations. As I read on, my heart began to race. Mary described her discovery of a family secret, a dark pact made long ago, involving a child and a ritual that had gone horribly wrong. The details were vague, but one thing was clear. The child in the photograph had been a key figure in the ritual, and his spirit had become bound to the black balloon, doomed to haunt the Hargrave family for eternity. Mary's final entries were disjointed, filled with desperate pleas and fragmented thoughts. She wrote of feeling watched, of hearing the boy's laughter in the dead of night, and of seeing his reflection in every mirror. Her last entry ended abruptly with a single haunting sentence, "He's coming for me." The diary ended there, with no explanation of what happened to Mary. But I didn't need one. I knew in my heart that the boy in the photograph, the spirit bound to the balloon, had claimed her just as it had claimed others before her. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. The photograph, the hidden room, the ritual, it all pointed to one thing. The curse wasn't just a random haunting. It was deeply personal, tied to my family's past in a way I was only beginning to understand. The mention of the hidden room sent a chill down my spine. I had lived in this house for months, but I had never explored the basement beyond a cursory glance when I first moved in. The thought of descending into the darkness to find that room filled me with dread, but I knew I had no choice. If I was going to break this curse, I needed to uncover every secret this house was hiding. With the diary in hand, I made my way to the basement. The door creaked as I opened it, the sound echoing through the house like a warning. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, the air growing colder with each step I took. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the flashlight I held in my trembling hand. The basement was, as I remembered, dank and cluttered, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and boxes piled in the corners. But as I shone the flashlight around the room, something caught my eye. A door, almost hidden behind a stack of old furniture. My heart pounded as I approached it, the sense of unease growing stronger with every step. The door was old, the wood warped and splintered. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But I knew I couldn't. This was the only way to end it. I reached out and grabbed the handle, my fingers cold and clammy. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a narrow passageway that led deeper into the basement. The walls were lined with old bricks, damp and crumbling, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. At the end of the passageway was another door, this one made of iron. My heart raced as I approached it, the sense of dread almost overwhelming. I could feel the presence of something malevolent on the other side, something ancient and evil. I pushed the door open, the heavy iron groaning as it swung on its rusty hinges. The room beyond was small and cramped, the air so cold it made my breath come out in visible puffs. And there, in the center of the room, was what I had been dreading. Black balloons. They filled the room, floating in eerie silence, their glossy surfaces reflecting the dim light of my flashlight. Each balloon was identical, their strings dangling like nooses. In the corner of the room was a small, rickety table covered in dust. On it lay the photograph Mary had described, the photograph of the boy. I approached the table, my heart pounding in my chest. The boy in the photograph was as Mary had described. Young, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes. He held a black balloon in his hand, his smile wide and unsettling. But there was something else about the photograph, something that made my blood run cold. The boy's eyes, they looked just like mine. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How could this be? Was this boy a relative, a distant ancestor? Or was there something even more sinister at play? My thoughts were racing, 1,000 questions flooding my mind with no answers in sight. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around me. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. I could feel the presence of the boy, his eyes watching me from the shadows, his voice whispering in my ear, though I couldn't make out the words. The black balloons began to move, slowly at first, then faster, spinning around the room as if caught in an unseen whirlwind. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the room darkened, the light from my flashlight flickering and fading. I knew I had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But just as I turned to run, I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder, freezing me in place. I whipped around, expecting to see the boy, but there was nothing, just empty air. The balloons had stopped moving, and the room was silent again, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I knew I couldn't stay in that room, couldn't face whatever dark force was tied to the boy and the balloons. I had to get out, had to find a way to break the curse before it consumed me. I grabbed the photograph from the table, holding it tightly as I fled the room, not daring to look back. The basement door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house like a death knell. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding. The image of the boy's twisted smile burned into my mind. When I finally reached the safety of the living room, I collapsed onto the couch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The photograph lay in my lap, a dark reminder of the horror I had just witnessed. But as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I had seen, a realization began to take hold, one that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The boy in the photograph wasn't just a distant relative. He was a part of me, tied to my bloodline in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. And the curse, the black balloon, it was my inheritance, passed down through generations, waiting for the right moment to strike. I thought the nightmare was over, that I had banished the spirit and severed its connection to this world. But I was wrong. The curse was still alive, still waiting, and now it had grown stronger, feeding on my fear, on my very soul. And as I sat there, clutching the photograph, I knew one thing for certain. The boy was coming for me. I spent the next few days in a state of near constant dread, the photograph of the boy never far from my mind. The house seemed to hum with an ominous energy, every shadow pregnant with the threat of something unseen. The black balloon, which had reappeared the night after I found the hidden room, now felt like a sinister companion, always lurking, always waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The boy, or whatever was left of him, was growing stronger, more insistent, feeding off my fear and confusion. And I had no idea how to stop it. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Each time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by dreams of the boy, his hollow eyes staring into mine, his twisted smile widening as he held out the black balloon. In these dreams, the house was different, decayed, abandoned, with rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. I would wander through endless hallways, always following the sound of distant laughter, but never finding its source. But the dreams were just the beginning. The paranormal activity in the house began to escalate, each occurrence more violent and disturbing than the last. It started with the cold spots, the sudden drop in temperature that would freeze the breath in my lungs. Then came the sounds, footsteps echoing in the hallways, doors slamming shut of their own accord, whispers that filled the air with a low, malevolent murmur. One night, I awoke to find every mirror in the house shattered, the glass shards scattered like jagged teeth across the floor. I tried to clean up the mess, but no matter how many times I swept, the glass would return, reforming into the same shattered pattern as if mocking my efforts. It was then that I realized the house was no longer just haunted. It was alive, twisted by the curse that had taken hold of it, warping reality into a nightmarish reflection of my own fear. I knew I had to act, but I didn't know where to start. Townsend's book had given me the ritual, but it had only bought me time. The diary had revealed the curse's origins, but not how to break it. And the photograph of the boy, his eyes that were so much like mine, only deepened the mystery. I needed help, someone who could guide me through the maze of my own past, someone who knew more about the dark forces I was up against. But I had already reached out to the only expert I knew, and Townsend had given me all he could. The desperation was suffocating, the sense of impending doom growing stronger each day. The balloon, which had once been a passive presence, began to move of its own accord, drifting through the house like a black omen. It would appear in different rooms, always at the edge of my vision, always watching. Then, one night, something changed. It was just past midnight. The house plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of the moon through the windows. I was in the living room, the photograph of the boy clutched in my hand, when I felt a sudden, crushing pressure in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The whispers that had plagued me for weeks grew louder, clearer, until they formed a single, coherent voice. It was a child's voice, cold and emotionless, but with an edge of something far more sinister. "Come to me," the voice whispered, echoing through the room. "It's time." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around me like a shroud. The photograph in my hand grew cold, the boy's eyes seeming to darken as the shadows in the room deepened. The balloon appeared then, floating slowly into the room from the hallway. But this time, it didn't stop at the doorway. It drifted toward me, its surface reflecting the moonlight in an eerie, unnatural way. I backed away, but the balloon followed, relentless in its pursuit. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Come to me, Emily. You know where to go." I didn't want to follow it, didn't want to go where it was leading me. But something inside me, a deep primal fear, told me I had no choice. The house, the curse, the boy, they were all connected, all part of the same dark web that had ensnared me from the moment I moved in. With trembling hands, I clutched the photograph and followed the balloon as it floated through the house, its path slow but purposeful. It led me down the hallway, past the shattered mirrors and cold spots, until we reached the basement door. I stopped at the top of the stairs, my breath hitching as I stared into the darkness below. The basement felt different this time, more oppressive, more alive. The air was thick with a sense of malevolence, as if something was waiting for me at the bottom, something I couldn't hope to face alone. But the voice left me no choice. "Come, Emily," it whispered, now closer, almost at my ear. "It's time to see." I gripped the railing and descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The balloon hovered just ahead of me, its surface rippling as if something inside was struggling to get out. The closer I got to the bottom, the colder the air became, until it felt like I was stepping into a tomb. When I reached the bottom, the balloon floated toward the iron door I had discovered days earlier. It paused there, bobbing gently, as if waiting for me to open it. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open, the iron groaning in protest. The hidden room was as I remembered it, filled with black balloons, the air thick with the scent of decay. But this time there was something new, a small, dusty box sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by the floating balloons. The box was old, its surface worn and cracked, as if it had been hidden away for centuries. My heart raced as I approached it, the photograph still clutched in my hand. I knew, without a doubt, that this box was the key to everything. The curse, the boy, the endless hauntings. The voice whispered again, now filled with anticipation. "Open it, Emily. Open it and see." My hands trembled as I reached for the box, the air around me growing colder with each passing second. The balloons seemed to close in, surrounding me, their strings swaying like tendrils. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to run. But I knew I couldn't. This was the only way to end it, the only way to break free. I opened the box. Inside, lying on a bed of black velvet, was a small, tattered doll. It was old, its fabric worn and stained, its button eyes missing. But it wasn't just any doll. Its face, though faded and torn, was unmistakable. It was the boy, My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the doll, the room around me spinning. The boy's face was etched into the fabric, a twisted smile sewn into his features. And then, as if in response to my recognition, the doll began to move. Its head turned slowly, creaking as it faced me, its empty eye sockets staring into mine. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in, as the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my ears with a chorus of voices. "You were always meant to find me," the doll whispered, its voice a distorted echo of the boy's. "You are the last. The curse ends with you." I backed away, horror clawing at my insides. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the walls closing in as the balloons pressed closer. The doll's smile widened, its fabric mouth curling into a grotesque grin. "There is no escape," it said, its voice now a low, malevolent growl. "You are mine." The photograph in my hand burned cold, the boy's eyes seeming to come alive on the page. I felt a pull, a force dragging me toward the doll, toward the curse that had claimed so many before me. The room began to spin, the whispers growing into a deafening roar. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, a voice cut through the chaos, a voice I hadn't heard in years. "Emily, you have to fight." It was my mother's voice, clear and strong, filled with the warmth and love I had almost forgotten. The room seemed to freeze, the shadows recoiling as the warmth of her voice filled the space. "Remember who you are," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. "You are stronger than this." Tears welled in my eyes as I clung to her voice, her words grounding me in the midst of the nightmare. The doll's grip on me loosened, the pull weakening as my mother's presence filled me with a renewed strength. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. "I won't let you take me." The doll's smile faltered, its head twitching as if in disbelief. The shadows around me began to dissipate, the balloons deflating and falling to the ground. The photograph in my hand grew warmer, the boy's eyes softening, losing their malevolent edge. With a final surge of strength, I threw the photograph onto the ground and stepped on it, grinding it beneath my heel. The room shook, the air crackling with energy as the doll let out a piercing scream, its fabric tearing as if it were being ripped apart from the inside. The scream echoed through the basement, the sound of it almost unbearable. But I stood my ground, refusing to give in to the terror that had haunted me for so long. I watched as the doll crumbled to dust, its curse finally breaking. The black balloons deflated one by one, falling to the floor in a lifeless heap. The darkness lifted, the oppressive energy dissipating as the room returned to normal. The iron door creaked shut, sealing the hidden room off once more. I was free. I collapsed to the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The curse was broken, the boy's spirit finally laid to rest. And for the first time in weeks, the house was silent, truly silent. But as I sat there in the darkness, a single thought lingered in the back of my mind, a question that refused to be silenced. Was it really over? Or was this just the beginning? The house was quiet, eerily so. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there were no whispers, no shadows shifting in the corners of my vision, no black balloon hovering ominously. It was over. I had broken the curse, or so I thought. But as the adrenaline began to wear off and the silence settled around me, doubt started to creep in. The calm felt unnatural, like the eye of a storm, deceptive, lulling me into a false sense of security before the tempest returned. And the question that gnawed at the edges of my mind remained unanswered. Was it really over? I spent the next few days trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, but it was like trying to patch up a sinking ship. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights sent my heart racing, my nerves frayed to the point of breaking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite my efforts to convince myself otherwise, I knew deep down that the nightmare wasn't truly over. The boy's spirit might have been banished, the black balloons destroyed, but the curse had been with my family for generations. It wasn't something that could be undone so easily. There was more to this, something darker and more insidious, hiding just beneath the surface. And it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. One evening, as I was trying to distract myself with a movie, The power suddenly cut out, plunging the house into darkness. My heart skipped a beat, fear clawing at my chest. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to navigate the now looming shadows. The air had grown colder, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. A knock echoed through the house, soft, almost polite, but it sent a shiver down my spine. It was coming from the front door. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to stay where I was and wait for it to go away. But something compelled me to move, to confront whatever was on the other side. Maybe it was the lingering determination from breaking the curse, or maybe it was a morbid curiosity, a need to know if my fears were justified. I walked to the door, each step heavy with dread. The knock came again, a little louder this time, more insistent. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before finally turning it and pulling the door open. There was no one there, just the cool night air and the faint rustling of the trees. I exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping my lips as I closed the door. But then, as I turned to walk away, I saw it. A black balloon. It was lying on the floor of the hallway, its glossy surface gleaming faintly in the dim light from my phone. My blood ran cold, fear flooding my veins. I had destroyed the balloons, all of them. How could it be back? Panic surged through me as I stared at the balloon, my thoughts spiraling out of control. This couldn't be happening. I had ended it. I had broken the curse. But the balloon was there, undeniable proof that I hadn't. I backed away, my mind racing for a way to escape, to get out of the house. But before I could move, the balloon began to rise slowly, drifting up from the floor until it hovered in front of me. And then, to my utter horror, it started to change. The balloon's surface rippled, warping and twisting as if something inside it was struggling to break free. It began to grow, expanding until it filled the hallway, its surface stretching like a grotesque, blackened membrane. The whispers returned, louder than before, swirling around me in a cacophony of voices. Emily, the voices called, a chorus of echoes reverberating through the house. You didn't think it was that easy, did you? The balloon continued to morph, its shape becoming more defined, more human. And then, with a sickening crack, it burst open, releasing a thick, black mist that filled the hallway. From within the mist, a figure emerged, a boy, the same boy from the photograph, but now older, his features twisted with anger and malice. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The boy's eyes locked onto mine, cold and lifeless, yet filled with a dark intelligence. He smiled, the same twisted grin from the photograph, but there was no innocence in it now, only a deep, malevolent satisfaction. You didn't end anything, he said, his voice layered with echoes of all the voices that had haunted me. You just set me free. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. What are you? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The boy tilted his head, his smile widening. I'm what's left of your family's sins, he said. The consequence of a promise broken, a pact that can never be undone. Your ancestors thought they could cheat death, but they only invited something far worse. He took a step forward, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, the shadows deepening. They summoned me, bound me to your bloodline, and now I'm part of you. You can't banish me, Emily. You can't escape me. I'm in your veins, your soul. I shook my head, denial surging through me. No, I defeated you. I destroyed the balloon. I ended the curse. The boy's laugh was a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the house. You ended nothing. The balloon was just a vessel, a symbol of what's inside you. You can destroy 1,000 balloons, but you'll never destroy me, because I am you. The reality of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. The curse wasn't just a ghostly presence or a haunted object. It was a part of me, something I had inherited along with my family's bloodline. The boy, the balloon, the endless torment. They were manifestations of something much deeper, something dark that had been passed down from generation to generation. Why me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Because you're the last, the boy said, his voice softening, almost tender. The last of the Hargraves, The final chapter in a story that began long before you were born. They all tried to fight it, just like you. But in the end, they all became part of it. He reached out a hand and I recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway seemed to stretch out endlessly behind me, the walls closing in. The shadows writhed and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that danced in the corners of my vision. "It's time to accept your fate, Emily," the boy said, his voice echoing with finality. "You can't fight what's inside you. You can't escape what you are." I shook my head again, tears streaming down my face. "No, I'm not like them. I won't give in." The boy's expression darkened, his smile fading. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice cold and cruel. "You never did." With that, the shadows surged forward, engulfing me in darkness. I felt the cold, clammy hands of the boy gripping my arms, pulling me down into the abyss. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if 1,000 voices were crying out in despair. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The darkness closed in, suffocating me, pulling me deeper and deeper until there was nothing left but the cold, black emptiness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I gasped for air, my eyes snapping open. I was lying on the floor of the hallway, the photograph still clutched in my hand. The balloon was gone. The boy's presence vanished. The house was quiet, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But the fear remained, a deep, gnawing terror that I couldn't shake. I knew now that the curse wasn't something that could be defeated with rituals or incantations. It was a part of me, woven into the fabric of my being, and it would never let me go. I had seen the truth, the sinister reality of my family's legacy, and I knew with a cold, sinking certainty that the boy would return. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day he would come for me again. And when he did, I might not be strong enough to resist. The final warning had been given. The truth had been revealed. And as I sat there in the darkened hallway, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I understood that the fight was far from over. Days passed, but the weight of the encounter lingered like a thick fog that refused to lift. The boy's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that the curse was far from broken, that it was a part of me, inescapable and insidious. The normalcy I once craved now felt like a distant dream, replaced by a grim awareness of the dark presence that hovered at the edges of my consciousness. I tried to carry on as if everything were normal. I went through the motions of my daily routine, forcing myself to eat, to sleep, to go outside. But every shadow seemed to hold the boy's gaze. Every whisper of the wind carried his taunting voice. I could feel him, just out of sight, watching, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. It was during one of those long, restless nights that I found myself poring over the diary again, searching for any detail I might have missed, any clue that could help me understand what I was truly up against. Mary Hargrave had known more than she let on. Of that I was certain. But the diary's abrupt and left too many questions unanswered. What had she discovered in her final days? What had driven her to the brink of madness? I had to know. Driven by a mixture of desperation and fear, I made the decision to dig deeper into Mary's life, to uncover the secret she had taken to the grave. The town of Blackmore, where she had lived and died, was only a few hours' drive away. I packed a bag and set out at dawn, the sun's first light casting long shadows across the road. As I drove, the landscape changed from the familiar suburban sprawl to dense woods and winding roads. The town of Blackmore was small, almost forgotten, tucked away in a remote corner of the state. The air grew heavier as I approached, a sense of foreboding settling over me like a shroud. The town itself was a relic of the past, old brick buildings with faded signs, narrow streets lined with ancient oaks, and an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if time had stopped here, the town preserved in a state of perpetual decay. I parked outside the town's small library, a crumbling stone building with ivy crawling up its walls. The inside was dimly lit, the smell of dust and old paper heavy in the air. The librarian, an elderly woman with a distant look in her eyes, directed me to the archives without asking any questions. It was as if she knew what I was looking for, as if others had come before me, searching for the same answers. I spent hours combing through old records, newspapers, and town registries, piecing together the fragments of Mary's life. She had been well known in Blackmore, a woman of means and influence, but also someone who kept to herself. Her death had been shrouded in mystery, the official cause listed as natural causes, though rumors of a more sinister nature persisted. But it was an old newspaper clipping that finally caught my eye. A story buried in the back pages of a local gazette, dated just a few days before Mary's death. The headline read, "Blackmore Woman Claims Haunted by Family Curse." The article was brief, but it detailed Mary's increasing paranoia, her claims that a dark force was after her, and her insistence that her death was imminent. She had spoken of a ritual gone wrong, of a child's spirit bound to her family by a pact made generations ago. The article ended with a chilling quote from Mary herself, "The curse won't end with me. It will find another. It always does." My hands trembled as I read those words, the reality of my situation sinking in. The curse wasn't just a random haunting or a punishment for past sins. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding off the fear and despair of those it targeted. And now it had latched onto me. I left the library feeling drained, my mind buzzing with the weight of what I had uncovered. Mary had tried to warn me, even from beyond the grave, but the question remained, why? What had she hoped to achieve by leaving behind these clues, by drawing me into the same nightmare that had consumed her? The answer, I realized, lay in the place where it all began. Mary's old house, the very house I now called home. I needed to go back, to confront whatever it was that had been waiting for me all this time. The answers, the truth, were hidden there, buried beneath layers of fear and time. The drive back felt longer, the road stretching out endlessly before me. By the time I reached the house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. The house loomed before me, its windows dark and lifeless, the air around it thick with the weight of all that had happened within its walls. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me like an old friend. The house was quiet, the oppressive energy that had plagued it in the past, now strangely absent. But I knew better than to let my guard down. The calm was deceptive, a prelude to the storm that was surely coming. I headed straight for the attic, the place where Mary had hidden her diary, where she had likely spent her last days. The air grew colder as I ascended the stairs, the darkness thickening with each step. By the time I reached the attic, my breath was coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic was as I remembered it, cluttered and dusty, filled with the remnants of lives long forgotten. But now, as I looked around, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, wooden box tucked away in the corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. I approached the box, my hands shaking as I lifted it out of its hiding place. It was old, the wood worn and cracked, the hinges rusted. There was no lock, just a simple latch that clicked open with a gentle push. Inside, I found a bundle of old letters, their paper yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant, each letter carefully formed, but the ink was faded, making it difficult to read. I carefully unfolded the top letter and began to read, my eyes straining to make out the words. The letter was addressed to Mary, written by someone named Eliza, a name that sent a jolt of recognition through me. Eliza Hargrave, Mary's mother. The letter spoke of a terrible mistake, a ritual that had gone horribly wrong, binding a spirit to the Hargrave bloodline in exchange for power and wealth. The ritual had been intended to protect the family, to ensure their prosperity for generations, but it had instead unleashed something dark and uncontrollable. Eliza wrote of her guilt, her regret at having ever agreed to the ritual, and her fear for Mary's future. She warned Mary that the curse would never be lifted, that it would follow the family for as long as their bloodline existed. But there was something else, a final, cryptic sentence that sent chills down my spine. The key to ending this is in your hands. But be warned, it comes at a great cost. I stared at the letter, my mind reeling. The curse had been passed down through the generations, its power growing with each new victim. But Eliza's words hinted at a way to end it, a key, hidden somewhere that could break the cycle. But what was the cost? And was I willing to pay it? As I placed the letter back in the box, something caught my eye. another photograph tucked beneath the bundle of letters. I hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at my insides, but I knew I had to look. I pulled the photograph out and held it up to the dim light filtering through the attic window. It was another image of the boy, but this time he was standing with a woman, Eliza. They were standing in front of the house, their expressions solemn, the boy's hand clutching a black balloon. But there was something off about the photograph, something that made my blood run cold. The boy's face was blurred, distorted, as if the camera had struggled to capture his image. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was a shadowy figure, a tall, thin man, his features obscured by darkness. I dropped the photograph, my hands trembling. The shadowy figure felt like a harbinger of something far worse, a presence that had been lurking in the background all along, waiting for its moment to step into the light. I knew then that the boy wasn't the only force at work here. There was something else, something more powerful, pulling the strings, guiding the curse along its twisted path. And if I was going to survive, I needed to uncover the identity of the shadowy figure and the role he played in the dark history of my family. But as I stood there in the attic, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The calm that had settled over the house was merely a pause, a brief respite before the final act. The boy had been just the beginning, a pawn in a much larger game. And the shadowy figure, the true master of the curse, was about to make his move. The air in the attic seemed to grow colder, denser, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The photograph of the shadowy figure still lay on the floor where I had dropped it, but I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. My mind raced with questions, each more terrifying than the last. Who is this figure? How was he connected to the curse? And why had he been hidden in the shadows, watching over my family like a dark guardian? The letters from Eliza Hargrave offered some clues, but they were incomplete, fragmented by time and faded ink. Eliza had warned Mary that the key to breaking the curse was within her grasp, but the cost of using it would be great. What that cost was, and how I was supposed to find the key, remained maddeningly elusive. I spent the next few hours in the attic rifling through old boxes, searching for anything that might help me piece together the puzzle. But the more I searched, the more hopeless it seemed. The curse was ancient, its roots buried deep in the past, and every answer I found only led to more questions. I was running out of time, and the feeling of being watched, of something malevolent lurking just out of sight, was growing stronger by the minute. As night fell, I knew I couldn't stay in the attic any longer. The darkness was oppressive, the silence deafening, and the weight of the discoveries I had made was too much to bear. I descended the stairs, the photograph and letters clutched in my trembling hands, my mind spinning with the gravity of what I had uncovered. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. I knew that tonight would be different, that the shadowy figure, whoever or whatever he was, would make his presence known. The boy had been just the beginning, a warning of what was to come. But the true threat was still waiting in the wings, ready to step into the spotlight. I sat down at the kitchen table, spreading out the letters and photograph in front of me. The faces of Eliza, Mary, and the boy stared back at me, their expressions solemn, almost mournful. The shadowy figure in the background seemed to loom over them, his presence a dark cloud hanging over their heads. The words from Eliza's final letter echoed in my mind. The key to ending this is in your hands. But be warned, it comes at a great cost. What could she have meant? What key was she referring to? And what would it cost me to use it? As I stared at the photograph, a thought began to take shape in my mind, one so horrifying that I could hardly bring myself to consider it. What if the key wasn't an object, but a person? What if the cost of breaking the curse was a sacrifice, one that I would have to make myself? The idea was almost too terrible to contemplate, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. The curse had been bound to the Hargrave bloodline for generations, feeding off the fear and suffering of those it targeted. To break it, I would have to sever that connection, to destroy the very thing that tied it to me. But how? And more importantly, who? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the front door, a soft, measured sound that sent a jolt of fear through me. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. The boy had returned. I stood up, my legs trembling, and made my way to the door. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. The shadows seemed to dance around me, shifting and twisting in the corners of my vision. I could feel the presence of the boy, his eyes watching me from just beyond the door. With a deep breath, I opened the door. The boy stood there, his small frame silhouetted against the night sky. He was holding a black balloon, its string wrapped tightly around his hand. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine, and he smiled, a smile that sent chills down my spine. "You found it," he said, his voice soft and cold, like a breeze on a winter's night. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Found what?" "The truth," he replied, his smile widening. "You know what you have to do." I shook my head, backing away from the door. "No, I don't understand any of this." The boy stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the house. The balloon floated above his head, bobbing gently as he moved. "You do, Emily. You've always known. The key has been with you all along." His words sent a shock of realization through me. The key to breaking the curse, the sacrifice, wasn't an object or another person. It was me. I was the last of the Hargraves, the final link in the chain that bound the curse to this world. To end it, I would have to break that chain. But how? The boy seemed to sense my hesitation, his expression softening slightly. "It doesn't have to be this way," he said, his voice almost gentle. "You can join us, be part of the family again. You won't be alone anymore." A cold dread washed over me as I realized what he was offering. The curse could continue, with me as its willing participant, its next vessel. I could join the boy, the shadowy figure, and all the others who had fallen victim to the curse, living in the shadows, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who came after me. Or I could end it, once and for all. I backed away further, my resolve hardening. "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I won't be part of this anymore." The boy's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You can't escape it," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "You're bound to it, just like all the others. You can't break the curse." I shook my head, backing up against the kitchen table. "I can. I have to." The boy's eyes darkened, his face twisting into a mask of anger. The shadows around him began to writhe, coalescing into the shape of the shadowy figure from the photograph. The figure towered over the boy, his presence filling the room with a dark, oppressive energy. "You think you can defy us?" The figure's voice boomed, deep and resonant, reverberating through the walls. "You think you can escape what you are?" The figure reached out, his hand stretching toward me, the shadows swirling around his fingers like smoke. I could feel his power, his malevolence, seeping into the air, suffocating me. But I refused to back down. "I can," I said, my voice rising above the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "And I will." With a surge of determination, I grabbed the photograph of Eliza and the boy from the table and held it up, the image of the shadowy figure glaring back at me. "This is where it ends," I said, my voice steady and strong. The figure recoiled slightly, his form flickering as if destabilized by my words. The boy's expression twisted into a snarl, his grip on the balloon tightening. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed. But I did. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew exactly what I had to do. The letters, the photograph, the rituals, they all pointed to one thing. The curse could only be broken by a final act, one that would sever the connection between the Hargrave bloodline and the malevolent forces that had taken hold of it. I turned and ran to the basement, the photograph still clutched in my hand. The boy and the shadowy figure followed, their presence a dark cloud that filled the air with a sense of impending doom. The house seemed to twist and distort around me as I descended the stairs, the walls closing in, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive. The basement door slammed shut behind me as I entered, the force of it nearly knocking me off my feet. I could feel the presence of the boy and the figure growing stronger, their voices echoing in my mind, taunting me, trying to break my resolve. But I wouldn't let them. Not now. The hidden room in the basement was, as I remembered it, cold, dark, and filled with black balloons. But now the shadows were thicker, more malevolent, swirling around the room like a living entity. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls pulsing with a dark energy. In the center of the room was the old wooden box I had found before, now glowing with a faint, eerie light. I approached it, my heart pounding, and opened the box. Inside, where the letters had been, lay a small, ornate dagger, its blade sharp and gleaming, its handle engraved with strange, ancient symbols. The key. I picked up the dagger, feeling its weight in my hand. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, and as I held it, I could feel the power coursing through it, a power that could either break the curse or bind it even tighter. The boy and the shadowy figure loomed behind me, their voices now a chorus of whispers urging me to stop, to turn back, to surrender. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. With a final surge of determination, I raised the dagger and plunged it into the photograph of the boy, the blade piercing through the paper, cutting through the image of the shadowy figure. The room exploded with light, the shadows shrieking as they were torn apart by the force of the ritual. The black balloons burst one by one, their remnants dissolving into the air like smoke. The boy screamed, his form flickering and distorting as the curse was ripped from him, the shadowy figure writhing in agony as he was banished back into the darkness. The ground shook, the walls trembling as the house itself seemed to cry out in pain. The light grew brighter, blinding, until all I could see was white. All I could hear was the deafening roar of the curse being torn apart, unraveled by the very force that had created it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the room falling into silence. The dagger lay on the floor, its blade dull and lifeless, the photograph torn and crumpled beside it. The black balloons were gone, the shadows banished, the air clear and still. I stood there, breathless, my heart racing. It was over. The curse was broken. The boy, the shadowy figure, the dark presence that had haunted me, they were all gone. But as I turned to leave the basement, a single thought crossed my mind, a thought that filled me with both relief and a lingering sense of dread. Had I truly ended the curse? Or had I simply traded one darkness for another? The house was quiet as I ascended the stairs, the weight of the dagger and the photograph heavy in my hands. The air was still, the shadows gone, but the memory of what I had faced lingered like a scar, a reminder that some things once broken could never truly be fixed. And as I stepped out into the cold night air, leaving the house behind, I knew that the fight was over, but the battle was far from won. The curse might have been broken, but its legacy, the darkness that had seeped into my soul, would be with me always. I had survived, but at what cost? Leaving the house felt like stepping out of a nightmare. The air was crisp and cool, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere that had permeated every corner of that cursed place. I didn't look back as I walked down the driveway and climbed into my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I drove away, the weight of what I had just done pressing down on me. The road stretched out before me, a dark ribbon cutting through the quiet countryside. My mind was a whirl of thoughts, a cacophony of fears, doubts, and the lingering echoes of the boy's voice. I wanted to believe it was over, that I had broken the curse and freed myself from the darkness that had haunted my family for generations. But a nagging feeling deep inside told me that the battle wasn't truly won. The drive was a blur, and before I knew it, I was pulling into the driveway of a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. I needed a place to rest, to think, to process everything that had happened. The dingy room was a far cry from the life I had known before the curse took hold, but it was a refuge, however temporary. I collapsed onto the bed, the events of the past days crashing over me in waves. My body ached with exhaustion, my mind racing to piece together the shattered fragments of my reality. The house, the boy, the shadowy figure. Had I truly banished them, or were they still lurking, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down? Sleep was elusive, my dreams haunted by the same twisted smile, the same hollow eyes. The shadowy figure loomed at the edge of every vision, his presence a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken root in my soul. But even in my dreams, there was no clear answer, no closure, just the same nagging doubt that had followed me since I left the house. When morning came, the sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting a pale light across the room. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, the heaviness in my chest refusing to lift. I needed to know the truth, to understand what had really happened. Had I truly broken the curse, or was it still lingering, hidden in the shadows, waiting to strike? There was only one person who might have the answers I sought. Robert Townsend, the paranormal investigator who had helped me once before. I dug out my phone and found his number, my fingers trembling as I dialed. The phone rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. "Emily," Townsend said, his voice calm and measured. "I was expecting your call." The fact that he had been waiting for me sent a shiver down my spine. I don't know what happened, Robert," I stammered. "I think I broke the curse, but it doesn't feel like it's over. I need to know, is it really gone?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching out until I began to doubt whether Townsend was still there. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with a gravity that made my heart sink. "Emily, curses like the one you faced are not easily broken," he said slowly. "What you did in that house was powerful, yes, but the darkness that has haunted your family for generations, it's not something that can simply be undone." I swallowed hard, dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. "What do you mean?" "I destroyed the balloons. I banished the spirit." "You may have severed the connection," Townsend interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "But you didn't destroy the darkness itself. It's part of you now, woven into your very being. The curse was tied to your bloodline, and by breaking it, you've taken its remnants into yourself." I felt the color drain from my face as his words sank in. "So it's not over?" Townsend sighed, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. "No, Emily, it's not. The curse was broken, yes, but its essence remains. You carry it with you now, like a scar that will never fully heal. The shadowy figure, the boy, they're gone, but the darkness is still there, lurking deep within you." I closed my eyes, my breath hitching as the weight of his words settled over me. "So what do I do now? How do I live with this?" Townsend was silent for a moment, as if carefully considering his response. "You have a choice, Emily," he finally said. "You can let the darkness consume you, allow it to dictate your life, or you can find a way to live with it, to control it. The key to your survival now lies not in banishing the darkness, but in accepting it as part of who you are." The idea of living with the curse, of carrying its remnants within me for the rest of my life, was almost too much to bear. But what other choice did I have? Townsend was right. I couldn't undo what had been done, and trying to fight it would only make things worse. I'll try," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But what if it's too strong? What if I can't control it?" "You're stronger than you think, Emily," Townsend replied, his tone reassuring. "You've already faced the worst of it and survived. The fact that you're still here, still fighting, proves that you have the strength to endure. The darkness may be part of you, but it doesn't define you." I wanted to believe him, to take comfort in his words, but the doubt still lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. "Thank you, Robert," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You're not alone in this," Townsend said softly. "If you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands what you're going through, you know where to find me." I hung up the phone, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I had broken the curse, but the darkness that had haunted my family for generations was now a part of me. I would have to live with it, to find a way to keep it at bay, to prevent it from consuming me as it had so many others. I sat in the motel room for a long time, staring out the window at the world beyond, trying to come to terms with the new reality I had been thrust into. The sun was shining, the day bright and clear, but it felt like a lie, a fragile illusion that could shatter at any moment. Eventually, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I gathered my things and checked out of the motel, the thought of returning to the house almost unbearable. But I couldn't run from it, couldn't hide from the truth. The house, with all its horrors and memories, was still mine, and I had to face it. The drive back was long and filled with a sense of impending dread. The landscape blurred past me, a constant reminder that the world outside was still turning, even as my own had been irrevocably altered. By the time I reached the house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. I stood outside the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The house looked the same as it always had, but I knew that everything had changed. The curse was gone, but the darkness remained, hidden in the walls, in the corners of my mind, in the very foundation of the house. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me like an old friend. The air was still, the silence heavy, but there was no sense of malevolence, no oppressive energy pressing down on me. The house was quiet, almost peaceful, as if it had finally been released from the grip of the curse. But as I walked through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that had been left behind in the aftermath of the ritual. The shadows seemed to move at the edge of my vision, shifting and twisting as if alive. When I reached the living room, I found it as I had left it. The photograph of the boy and Eliza still lying on the table, the torn and crumpled remains of the image a stark reminder of what I had done. The dagger was gone, its purpose fulfilled, but the memory of it remained, a sharp pain in my chest. I sat down on the couch, the weight of everything that had happened crashing over me in waves. I had survived the curse, but the cost had been great, too great. The darkness would be with me always, a constant reminder of the horrors I had faced, the choices I had made. And as I sat there, alone in the quiet house, I knew that my life would never be the same. The curse had been broken, but its legacy, its darkness, would follow me forever. I had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The final unveiling had come, and with it a new understanding of the curse that had plagued my family for generations. I had uncovered the truth, faced the darkness head on, and come out the other side. But the scars it had left on my soul would never fully heal. And as the shadows deepened and the night began to fall, I knew that I would have to find a way to live with the darkness, to keep it at bay, and to ensure that it never took hold of me again. Because if I didn't, it would consume me, just as it had consumed all those who came before me. The house was quiet, the night still, but I knew that the darkness would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. And when that moment came, I would have to be ready to fight, because the darkness, once unleashed, never truly dies. If our tales gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more spine-tingling stories, and drop a comment with your scariest experience. Your support keeps the horror alive.